Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well in this time of continued social distance, quarantine, whatever terminology you want to use. I want to just spend a couple minutes just giving some reflections on uh, this time of social distancing in the church and the issue of not gathering together in worship in large groups. The vast majority of churches seem to be heeding the warnings about getting together in large groups for worship. There are unfortunately a handful of pastors who have defied that and who have gotten together. And I know there is a pastor I heard in the, I want to say Pittsburgh area, as I recall, who is planning to have some big massive worship service on Easter Sunday and is just thumbing his nose at everything about this in order to have it. I want to talk a little bit about that from my perspective as a pastor. I've had 35 years in ministry. That certainly doesn't make me an expert on everything, certainly doesn't make me right on everything, but I have been around the block a little bit. So I just want to offer some thoughts as a pastor who thinks that we should be heeding this advice in this time. So let me first just say a few things. First of all, I mean, this is just not a conspiracy. Unfortunately, there are some pastors who have, for some reason, bought into the idea that there's some big conspiracy going on, or that this is a hoax, a worldwide hoax. I would say that if you believe that, then you really need, as if you're a Christian and you believe that, you need to do some real soul searching on what sources you are feeding your mind and your soul with. I know there's a lot of conspiracy sources out there, a lot of web pages you can go to, and there's certainly some people on the radio and on TV who are peddling these kinds of things. And I just hope that as pastors who are supposed to really be able to speak on the truth, not that we always know it, of course, but we are supposed to speak the truth as best we know it, that we are feeding ourselves with material from sources that can be trusted and are reliable. Not that they're always right, but that they endeavor to be fair, endeavor to do their research, and are not always fomenting baseless ideas. And so there's nothing conspiratorial about this time of pandemic or hoax. In fact, we were due for one. Everything I've read is that the globe seems to have a pandemic approximately every century. So the last one was 1918. We are certainly due for one now. I know there are outliers out there. Sweden is not a country that is enforcing any kind of isolation. But what happens with them, whether there's an outbreak, remains to be seen. Right now, people are wondering. California certainly has a lot of cases, but they seem to be lower than the norm. One of the things we need to be careful about is not to make the exceptions the rule. And there's always, in every study, in every case, and everything that happens, there's always going to be an exception for some reason. I think we should ask those questions. Why, at this point, does California seem to have lower case? Was it because they acted early? San Francisco, I know, acted very early. I think those things should be studied. But the one thing we ought not to do is take the exceptions and now somehow make them the norm, to say that the norm is not what it appears to be, or that we're overreacting to this. No, the norm seems to be that if you don't isolate yourself off, you're going to end up with a lot more cases than you want. So we need to be careful about making the exceptions the rule. Very important, and that's true in everything. One other thing I want to mention before I move into, I think, what pastors should heed in this time. And that is, this is not a persecution of the church. I'm hearing that from some people, that this is an opportunity for the church is not allowed to worship. We're being told we can't worship. We're having our religious freedom taken away, and this is persecution. Friends, in the United States, we just need to drop that line. It's not that the church is always favored in our society, and at times we do sense that perhaps we're not being treated fairly. There are times when that happens, and I get that. But the reality is, let's save the persecution talk for places where Christians really are being persecuted. Let's save it for Nigeria. Let's save it for China. We are not being persecuted. This is not a focus on the church. It's not that the governmental authorities came out and said only churches cannot gather together. This is a blanket prohibition for stores, for all kinds of social gathering places. And so it's not just the church that is being singled out. So there's nothing here that is stepping on our religious freedom. There's nothing here that signals persecution. We are part of a community, a society in which this is the responsible thing to do. And that is part of what that is not to gather together for worship. And that makes perfect sense. We have not been worshiping now for several weeks. We'll not be worshiping until we get some kind of go-ahead from our bishop that it's okay. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't like that. When it first came down that we might need to cancel worship, I can remember contacting my leadership by email and running it by them, and at first saying, I'm not overly comfortable with this at this point. I think we should still gather together. But then just 3 days later, it became apparent that that was not a good idea. And the leadership agreed. And so we decided not to have worship. This is not easy for me. I love coming on Sundays and greeting everybody and fellowshipping, and I love the worship. So this is not something that pastors really would choose to do. But we're not being persecuted here, folks. We're being asked to be responsible, and I think that that's the right call. Now, let me say something as a pastor. So 2 things. As a pastor, we are all who are pastors charged with the care of our community, first and foremost. I am charged to be a pastor and to care for my congregation as best I can. I'm not perfect. I have not always lived up to the ideal of what a pastor should be. I know that. I have, like every other pastor, I have gifts, but I have limitations. But my job is to care for the well-being of everyone, physical as well as spiritual. And it just seems to me that pastors who make the decision to hold public worship services in this time are not caring for their congregations as they should. They are not being responsible. And in fact, I will say this right out loud to you, and I know that most of you pastors who are listening, I'm preaching to the choir, so I understand that. But any pastor who insists on this time, on gathering a congregation together for worship, is guilty of malpractice, is guilty of pastoral malpractice, plain and simple. There's nothing to be gained by this. There's no witness to the gospel in this. We are not different from everybody else as Christians. The idea that somehow God will protect us because we're Christians is not biblical. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Just because we're faithful Christians does not mean we will escape the trials and tribulations of those around us who may not be believers. At the center of our faith is the suffering of the cross. Perhaps the theologian in the Christian church, St. Paul, and the greatest missionary, suffered a lot of persecution in his time and suffered a lot. He was not spared from any of that. So this crazy idea that because we're Christians, if we get together and worship together, we will somehow be spared and saved. That's just bad theology, plain and simple. And if it's pastoral malpractice, pastors, what we say does matter to some people, not everybody, but our words can carry weight, and they can carry weight with our congregations. And there would be people. I mean, if I said, "Listen, we're going to ignore all this and we're going to worship," there would be a lot of people in my congregation who would simply say I'm crazy, and they would be right to suggest that, and they're not going to come no matter what. But there are some people who, because I have said it, because my words are out there, and because they love Jesus and because they love the church, they would show up. and they would be put at risk. And so that is just not good pastoral care. It is not caring for our congregations. Second point along with that, let me say, is that we are also to care for our communities in which we find ourselves. In my Wesleyan tradition, in my Methodist tradition, I'm appointed by the bishop. I'm appointed to Ashland First United Methodist Church. That's my appointment. But I'm also appointed to the larger community. I am to guide my congregation in ministry to the community. I am to lead them in ministry to the community. The world is our parish, right? That's John Wesley's words. The world is my parish. The world is our parish. And so we have a responsibility to the community. It does not further the cause of the gospel of Jesus Christ to bring congregations together to worship in this time, to expose them, possibly expose them to the coronavirus, and then expose others in the community. I do not mind asking my congregation to take risks for the gospel. We're told to take risks for the gospel. And I don't mind asking my congregation to do that as long as I'm willing to take the same risks. What we should not be asking our churches, our congregations to be doing is to take unnecessary risks that do not further the cause of the gospel and, in fact, can undermine the cause of the gospel. How does it serve the witness of the church in any community if there is a breakout of the coronavirus and it can be traced back to a church that refused to stay at home on Sunday morning? That certainly is not a witness. No, we witness to the gospel in this time by loving our neighbor, by staying at home if we can. And also not only staying at home if we can for the sake of just anybody in the community, but especially for those who have to be out, our first responders, our healthcare folks, the person who bags the groceries, the person who stocks the shelves, the person who has to be at the gas station. These are people who have no choice but to be out here. We love them, friends. We love them the way Jesus would love them, by staying home. And yes, we've got to get out at times. We've got to get the groceries. We have to go to the doctor. Everybody knows that. But to take the precautions when we have to go out and not go out unless we have to. This is pastoral care. This is how pastors encourage people in this time, encourage the followers of Jesus in this time to continue to love God, to continue to love neighbor, and not make a macho, ridiculous show of courage, which is not courage at all. There is a fine line between courage and stupidity. And the last thing the world needs is a congregation with a hold my beer theology that says we can get together and we'll be fine and we don't have to worry about anything else. Nope, friends, that's not the way we are. We bear witness to the good news in this time by following the rules the way everybody else. There are times when Christians can witness by breaking the rules, right? There are examples of that throughout our history. There are times we have to do that. This is not one of those times. This is a time to follow Jesus and recognize social distancing. As I continue to say, that thank God in this time of social distancing, we have a God who does not observe social distancing because God doesn't have to, but God is with us and He is with all of us. Let's bring the presence of God and the love of Jesus to others by staying away where we need to stay away, in order that at some point we'll all be back out together again and we'll be worshiping and we'll be doing everything that we've been doing, and we'll be back to the routine. Okay, friends, that's all I have to say for the moment. I feel much better now. And I hope that things continue to go well for you. And I just ask that in this day that as you go about your routine, whatever it may be, I just will ask God to be with you and to bless you and surround you with His love and grace. And just continue to bear witness to the good news in word and in deed. Have a great day, friends.